My younger sister is going through a very disturbing phase. My sister has gone through several phases. There was the emo scene phase of her early teens, an emotionally tumultuous time during which our house was filled with core music, and she was rarely seen without a wrist full of bands. Her hair, when it was not dyed jet black, was staked with red, or occasionally blue, and sometimes even green. My parents tolerated it. I endured it, being 2 years older than her, though in my mind, immeasurably older, and tried to combat the harsh, often shrieked vocals of her music with the surprisingly preferable noise of video game simulated gunfire.
I started receiving weird VHS tapes in the mail. I never asked for them, but they keep arriving day after day. In every package is a note telling me the exact time to share it with the world, to get it seen by as many people as possible. If I don't, they said, bad things will happen. The following presentation is the contents of one of those tapes. Please help me and watch until the end.
Her moods changed more often than she changed clothes, but fortunately, the phase was short-lived. Post-high school, she entered her veganism phase, being virtually indoctrinated into it by friends she'd made during her freshman year in college. You'd think this would be better, with her thousands of miles away, only visiting for the major holidays. But no, it was much worse than the phase that preceded it, exactly because of the distance. She'd made considerable effort to inform us, through calls, texts, emails, and mailed pamphlets of the cruelty with which farmed animals are handled, and while my parents and I agreed that the conditions for these creatures were often harsh, we politely though firmly told her we'd still continue with our carnivorous lifestyles. She of course equated us to several genocidists throughout her human history, and caused several scenes at Thanksgiving and Christmas, both holidays of course having various meats served. Eventually, she mellowed out, an ideological dampening my parents attributed to the inevitable diminishing of the phase, but which I suspected was the result of a guy who most likely ate meat, and either argued with or simply ignored her impassioned vegan policing. Her attempts to proselytize were reduced to recommending documentaries every few weeks. 4 weeks after the noted change in her campaigning, she abandoned the attempts to quiz us on the documentaries we half-heartedly watched at her request. By the end of her freshman year, she'd pretty much reverted back to her default state, amicable, non-confrontational, normal. I figured there'd be another phase. Things always happen in threes, right? And waited for some dramatic pronouncement in which she declared to have finally seen some previously obfuscated truth. But she remained normal throughout her break, during which she stayed at home in her old room. I had yet to move out. I'd had the same job for the last several years and they'd given me a managerial position when I'd graduated high school. She finally showed us pictures of her new friend, and I of course flaunted the confirmation of my suspicions to my parents behind my sister's back. When she went back for the spring semester, things seemed like they'd continue on being normal. I began to doubt my aforementioned belief in the occurrence of threes. Hope sprang up in my heart for a sister who'd finally develop her own sincerely held passions and express them like a sane-minded human being. When February rolled around, and my sister called home on a Monday night, unusual, given her schedule, my hope was completely, terribly effaced. I was sitting in the living room watching a show when my mother's phone rang. She came into the living room from the kitchen where she'd been cooking, and picked up her phone from the coffee table. She answered, greeted my sister with the appropriate surprise, given the time of day, and then said alright in quick succession. She turned to me, a look of confusion on her face, and passed me the phone. She wants to talk to you. Needs to. I took the phone and put it to my ear, and before I could even greet her my sister shouted my name. I winced away, then asked her to lower her voice. She apologized, and I heard her breathing come out in stuttered rasps as she waited for me to respond. I nearly asked why she hadn't just called me on my phone, but then remembered that I had left it upstairs to charge. Did you get my texts? Did you get them out of the house? I can't talk for long. He's inside paying for gas right now. He'll be back any second. Despite my request from only seconds ago, she hadn't lowered the volume of her voice, had just spoken in a tone that was less of a shout, and more of a panicked hiss. The words came out in almost a single stream, barely intelligible. I asked what she was talking about, and she let out a noise that was a bizarre mix of a moan and the beginning of a laugh. A noise that was unmistakably the result of a mind teetering on the edge of sanity. The texts. I sent you so many texts." My sister's voice was so loud that my mom whipped around on her way back to the kitchen, having heard her daughter's voice blare through the phone. The call wasn't being fed through the speaker. The voice had just been that loud. My mom's face quickly changed from a look of confusion to an expression of motherly worry, and her eyes questioned me about her daughter's apparently manic state. I shrugged, then held up a hand for her to wait while I questioned my still screaming sister. It took several tries to silence her before she finally let up, and I quickly asked a series of questions before she could get back to screaming. I told her that my phone had been upstairs charging, and asked what the texts had been about. I also asked if she were alright, and if she'd please stop screaming so I could have a proper conversation with her. She listened to all this quietly, although her breathing was still labored, either due to the exhaustion of having nearly blown out the phone's speakers, or the result of some anxiety whose source she had yet to share with me. I expected some long outpouring of emotion, perhaps related to the guy I'd suspected had come into her life and dismissed her militant vegan persona, but instead, in a voice that was barely above a whisper and yet packed more tones of emotion than her screams, she said, "If you don't know, then it's too late. There's no fight left in me now." She then hung up the phone. I sat on the couch, rendered speechless by the gravity that had been intoned in those parting words. My mom approached and asked what my sister had said, but I only extended the phone to her. She took it, put it in her pocket, and sat beside me on the couch. I stared ahead, my gaze resting on the TV but not really seeing it. My sister's words, though vague, had carried an indescribable suggestion of bleakness, of ill-fated mortality. My mom put a hand on my shoulder, and again asked what my sister had said, this time making no attempt at disguising her worry. My expression had frightened her, the dire import of my sister's words imparted through my dumbstruck face. I repeated what my sister said, though I couldn't begin to convey the way she had said it. Still, this caused my mom a great deal of worry, and she pulled out her phone. As her shaking hands flew over the unlock screen, she called out to my father, who had been upstairs working in his study. He descended just as my mom put the phone to her ears. She didn't have to tell me what she'd heard. The automated speech was audible enough with her sitting right beside me. "I'm sorry, the call cannot be completed as dialed. Please try again." My mom stared dumbly at the phone as tears began to swell in the corners of her eyes. I was similarly affected, though tears hadn't yet risen in mine. In any other situation, the message might have made sense, considering the trembling that had come to my mother's hands at the onset of her worry. But I'd watch her place the call. She hadn't dialed. She'd gone to her contact list and selected my sister's name, something she'd done a million times if once. My sister's phone, for whatever reason, had been disconnected following my strange conversation with her. My dad looked from my mom to me, an expression of amusement on his face. My mom, now on the verge of total mental collapse, retried her attempt to contact my sister, and her expression of dread told me of its futility. She threw the phone onto the table, then practically ran to my father, who held her in an embrace while mouthing, "What the hell is going on?" before I could open my mouth. My mom pulled her face away from my dad's now tear-stained t-shirt, and wailed out, "Something's wrong with our daughter." My father's eyes shot to me, his eyebrows raised in a manner that asked a question I immediately understood. He wondered if my sister was undergoing yet another phase, one that might somehow be worse than the vegan one. I shrugged, and he returned his attention to my mom. As he stroked her hair, unsure of how to calm her, he turned to me and said, offhandedly, "Oh, your phone was going off quite a bit earlier. Were they expecting you at work today?" My phone. My sister had said that she'd tried contacting me several times, without answering him, leaving him to console my mother despite having no knowledge of the issue. I sprinted upstairs to my room. When I returned downstairs, phone in hand, my parents were sitting on the couch. My dad's phone was to his ear, but before I had fully entered the living room, he was shaking his head. He hadn't been able to get in touch with my sister either. They looked at me, eyes full of both worry and hope that the messages contained information that would explain my sister's strange behavior and the sudden disconnection of her phone line. I unlocked my phone, and was surprised to find only 4 text messages and missed call with an accompanying voicemail. Given the circumstances, I expected to see a greater number of attempts to reach me. I opened the text messages, with the first having been sent shortly after I'd put my phone on my wireless charging pad in my room. The next one followed a few minutes after the first, the third about an hour after that, and the final text only 2 minutes after the third. I read through them all 3 times, then put my phone on the coffee table before the couch so my mom and dad could read them. My mom's trembling hand reached out, but froze mid-grab. She was petrified by the frightful uncertainty of what they might contain. My dad, a bit more accustomed to familial issues than her, he'd lost a brother growing up, grabbed the phone and read through the texts. Ordinarily well composed, his face soon shifted into an expression of distress that elicited a startled cry in my mother, who finally seized the phone and read the messages herself. A few moments later she dropped the phone and began wailing insensibly, a fit of unprecedented hysterics that neither my dad's embrace nor his soothing words could calm. These are the texts. Nothing has been changed. 4:38 p.m. You were right, but you probably already know that. Mark was the reason. It started with jokes. He'd say things like, plants are alive. 2. You are just trading one cruelty for another. He'd call me, terror of the trees, or, broccoli butcher. Things worsened after that, though. He'd sneak meat into my foods. Nothing major, just bits of bacon or beef or ham cubes, but still enough to where I'd taste it, and feel guilty at how good it tasted. Then he'd laugh, and do something to make me forget about it, or outright forgive him. It went on like this for weeks, until he stopped trying to make it up to me, and insisted that I suck it up, and stop whining about rightfully indulging in the meat of weaker species. Unfortunately, I did. I ate the meat, and became a vegan only in name. 4:43 p.m. We had stew the other day. Meat, potatoes, carrots, onions. It was really good. I've basically been living with him. He lives in a decently sized house off campus, in a pretty nice neighborhood. His parents are pretty rich, and bought him the house after his mandatory first year in the dorms. Ordinarily, I'd cook something and bring it over, but that day he insisted on cooking, and said that I'd be eating meat. It wasn't a question or a statement that left room for argument, but an order. I was tired of fighting, of resisting, so I went along with it, just wanting to have a nice day with him. We ate, and oh my god, the stew was amazing. I hadn't had something so deliciously savory in years. It made the relatively simple meal seem like something that had been expertly and painstakingly prepared. Mark was happy to see me enjoy it so much, but there was something off about the happiness. His expression became a bit too happy, more than just an expression of pride or relief at a guest enjoying his cooking. 5:33 p.m. You have to believe that I had no way of knowing or even suspecting the truth. How could I have? I'd never tasted it before, and even though it hadn't tasted normal compared to past experiences with meat, no one's mind would naturally make such a terrible leap. When he brought me into the basement and showed me the refrigerated section, I was understandably shocked. It's not often, if ever, you hear of someone butchering and storing their own meats. But when he opened the massive steel door, I knew at once what I'd just eaten only minutes before. The chilled carcasses hanging from hooks in that cold, misty space weren't those of animals. I recognized that immediately. I was shocked, disgusted at myself and the sight before me, and scared of Mark, because at that moment I believed that I was going to join those butchered forms. There were even a few empty hooks suspended from the ceiling, swinging eerily from some cooling draft. 5:35 p.m. I'm still afraid, but now the source of my fear is different. I'm not afraid of Mark anymore. I'm actually thankful, albeit shamefully, that he's given me this opportunity. I've been so stupid, especially during that phase of veganism. There's nothing wrong with eating meat, nutritionally or ethically. Mark has shown me that, has allowed me to experience the truth firsthand. And there's a kind of meat that's so much better than all the others, a meat that once tasted becomes all you can think about. It's enamoring, almost spiritually captivating. I love it, but I'm also afraid of what it means for my life, and what I'll have to do now. Mark's supply isn't infinite, and it isn't easy to procure this special kind of meat. Now that I've had it, now that I've seen his collection, I'm embroiled in the whole thing. I'll have to help him get more meat. I want to help him. Left double quotation mark. I stood frozen in front of the coffee table while my mom sobbed into my dad's arms. He looked at me, and for the first time in my life I saw a look of utter despair on my father's face. It was terrible, unsettling, and I would have been reduced to an emotional state similar to my mother's if I hadn't suddenly remembered that my sister had also left a voicemail. Without bothering to first listen to it myself, I played the voicemail through my phone speakers. It was much shorter than the contents of the text messages, but carried that same grave tone that my sister had spoken with in her phone call earlier. Here is a transcription of the voice message. "You have to leave the house. Now. Get them out. We're coming. Mark insists that in order to show my devotion to him, to the meat, the first meal we prepare together must be from a family recipe. Please, Hayden, you have to leave the house. I know I can't stop him, and I don't know if I'll be able to stop myself. I'm so hungry, hungrier than I've ever been." By the end of the message, my mom had stopped crying, shocked to utter silence, terrified beyond all sense. It took 3 shouts of my name by my father to snap me out of my own horrified state, and when I regained awareness of my surroundings, my dad was ushering my mom into the kitchen, towards the door that led into the garage. With a mind numbed by terror, I followed along automatically. We bundled into my dad's SUV and sped out of our driveway and onto the darkly lit street. Despite seeing no one for several miles, it felt like something tirelessly hounded us. Some presence, or deep desire psychically projected by a pursuer who hadn't yet picked up our trail. We'd checked into an unremarkable motel about 200 miles outside of our town. My mom is completely benumbed, barely conscious of anything beyond the most basic stimuli. My dad's face is set in a perpetual expression of anxiety, and every time I close my eyes, I see Mark's face, shown to me in pictures sent by my sister months ago, but warped hideously, devilishly, into a grin of cannibalistic malice, with bloodied strips of human flesh sticking out between sharpened ivory teeth. And in these awful, mind-assaulting images, I see my sister beside him, her face similarly transformed, her grin equally murderous. A few minutes ago, my dad called our neighbors and asked if they'd seen anything unusual going on around our house. I saw the color drain from his face as he listened to what they said, and then ended the call. I met his gaze, my question sent through the look alone. Too terrified to speak, he cleared his throat, and without looking at my mother, who sat on the edge of their bed, looking absent-mindedly out the window, said, "Alan and Lee said they saw your sister and a man pull into the driveway, enter the garage, and then leave a few minutes later. But aside from that, nothing else." My dad put the phone on the bedside table, turned off the lamp, and gently laid my insensate mother on the bed beside him. A few moments later, when my trembling had subsided and my fear had died down to a manageable degree, I went to the motel door, ensured that it was locked, and climbed into my own bed. It was all just familiar, habitual behavior. Despite the hour, I knew that I wasn't going to get a second of sleep. I don't know what neighborhood Mark lives in, what kind of car he drives, or if Mark is even his real name. Calling the police seems pointless. I think my dad arrived at the same decision sometime earlier in the day. Otherwise, I think he wouldn't have called them by now. My sister, by the guidance of some awful, possibly even inhuman cannibal, has developed a deep desire for human flesh, and is even willing, monstrously, to devour her own family. As I laid my head on my pillow, I silently prayed that I'd never see her again.